السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. نحمده ونصلي على رسوله الكريم. ما بعد. Inshallah, today we'll be starting the 12th juz, which is, majority of it is Surah Hud and partially Surah Yusuf. As I mentioned yesterday, we started the surah, but it was only half a page of Surah Hud, and then we ended the juz ends over there, so that's where we stopped. In the surah, there are mention of many prophets and many different incidents that took place. One was the incident of Nuh alayhi salatu wasalam being told to build the ark and the warning of what is to come. As we know, the Prophet Nuh alayhi salatu wasalam, he preached for many years, right, over 950 years. And after all the efforts, eventually Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave this news that the punishment is going to come. One thing before we move forward, the Mufassirin mentioned that after all of those years of preaching, there are different numbers, but there's a number that is mentioned that there was less than 80 people who were believing at that time. I want us to think of our situation, and in any scenario that we are dealing with or we have dealt with in the past, and to think that, and this is actually very common in the youth of today, probably in the adults as well, but there's a lot of studies and statistics regarding the youth and the youngsters, where when we don't see a result, we don't see a change, we immediately give up and we think nothing's working. We think that there's no point, there's no benefit. For example, there's the leadership program that we have going on right now. I was speaking to one of the youngsters, and he mentioned that I've been going for a few weeks now, or I can't remember if he said a few weeks or a few months, and nothing has changed. I don't see any benefit in that. And I've gone through the content of what is being taught. I'm not involved in it, but I've gone through some of the content. And there's a lot of important lessons that are being taught, practiced, implemented through different activities. I'm like, what do you mean there's no, how do you say there's no benefit? It says that, I haven't changed. I was like, how old are you? How long did it take you to become the way you are today? You think you're going to undo all of that in 4 weeks? Or in a few months? No. So even after lots of effort, lots of time, still we may not see results. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't try and that we shouldn't make an effort. Nuh alayhi salam made effort for hundreds of years, as I mentioned. And then finally, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when the time was when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had decreed, then He gave the news. Now, one interesting point is that Nuh alayhi salam was told to build an ark. He didn't know what an ark was. He didn't know. It's not like there was you just call up the different companies and see which one is giving the best rate. The wahi was given on how to build it as well. And the Mufassirin mention over here under these ayat that many of the inventions of today, they are actually from the times of the prophets. And they are through the wahi. Through the wahi, the inventions were brought to us. And many times we forget this. We think that it's man, the brain of man is what has achieved everything that we are today. And in that, the Mufassir even writes over there, he says that even when it comes to our conveyance, As Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying, Bismillahi majreha wa mursaha. That with the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the ark flows and it comes to a stop. And this is a reminder for us as well. And Mufassir mentions over there that even in this day and age, with all the technological advances, still this applies. And when I read that, it was actually a big reminder for me, and it was a point to think about. That when I drive my car, I'm thinking like my feet and the pedals is what's moving me, and pressing the brake is what's stopping me. But it's actually a reminder that only through the permission of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala do I move. Does my vehicle move? And only through the permission of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does it come to a stop. And I thought this was very cool, that we should think about this whenever we are getting into a conveyance, whenever we are getting onto a ship or into a plane, or we are getting into our car. Everything is in the control of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Everything is through His mercy. And this is what Nuh alayhi salam as well, when they boarded the ark, they're reminded that this ark is going to move through the permission of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and it will only stop through the permission of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. There can be as much water and there could be no water. It doesn't matter. It is through the permission of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Lastly, as we know, Nuh alayhi salam, when he was told to bring his family, the believing family, there was one son who he felt bad for, that he wanted to call him as well, and he tried calling him. And he told him that, he sees him, the water is coming around him, and he's telling him, La asim al-yawm min amrillah, illa man rahim. But the son is stubborn. He doesn't want to listen. And later on, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala corrects Nuh alayhi salam for making dua and asking for his son. But regardless of that, we won't get into the details of that. The stubbornness of the son and realizing, again, the power and the might of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? Today's whole few minutes that we have, it's all dedicated to that. Understanding that everything is in the control of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? And that time, Nuh alayhi salam is telling his son, but his son is not listening. Many times in our situation, alhamdulillah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us iman, and we believe. The Mufassirin mentioned actually that the Nuh alayhi salam was possible that he thought that his son also had iman, but he was a hypocrite, or he was a munafiq, that he didn't truly believe, or he believed deep down, but he was still acting not in accordance with his belief. Regardless, in our case, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has blessed us with iman, but many times we forget the power of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We forget the control of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and we think the matters are in our own hands. So when we look at these ayat and we recite these ayat today, we should ponder of this, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is in control of everything. Nothing is in our control. Nothing is according to what I want. It's all according to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's plan. So when we read these ayat, especially the first quarter, we will be going through these ayat. Inshallah, we can ponder on this and think of the ayat that are being recited. Inshallah, as I mentioned, and we are covering part of Surah Yusuf as well, but because the time is very short, I decided we'll just talk about Nuh alayhi salam today, and inshallah we'll cover a little bit of Yusuf alayhi salam tomorrow. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grant us all the tawfiq to benefit from the gems of the Quran. Ameen wa akhiru da'wana alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen.